We are going to resume with our third and final part of unit testing. So we've unit tested the index method. We've got full code coverage. So we want to unit test the details method. So if we have a look here at our details method, how many different scenarios do we have here? How many different unit tests do you think we should write to cover our details method? Okay, Lindsay, you say 4. I tend to think so. So what are the different scenarios that we should be checking here? Okay, so yeah, so here's our first if. So what happens in this scenario? What's happening? Right, so the user is calling details, product details, but there is no ID. So to simulate this, right, that's what should happen. So I go to details. So right now, we'll just wait for this to load for a second. Right, I go to details, but if I have no ID parameter, right now I just get a blank screen. So again, our unit test is going to help us improve the scaffolded code. Right, if I go to my web tools in my browser and go to network, if I refresh this, right, I get a 404, which is the right response, but I'm not seeing anything. So this isn't handled very well by the scaffolded code. We should probably fix this up. Right, so it does return simply an HTTP status of 404, but it doesn't kind of leave the user hanging. So that's our first scenario. What's happening in this scenario? Again, it's returning a not found. But what's happening here? So our first if is if the ID is null. What would trigger this condition? Right, so in this case, we do have an ID, but that product doesn't exist. So something like this, for example, right? We've got an ID, but this is still going to return a 404 response because that product doesn't exist. So we need a separate unit test for that condition. And then if neither of these are true, I would say, and Lindsay, you were suggesting we need 2 more tests, right? So what 2 things should we test? Right. Yeah, we should check that the view load that's loading is called details. And we should check that it loads the correct product. We pass in ID 37, we get product ID 37 back. We don't get product 52 instead. Okay. Now, we should clean these up. So instead of just returning 404 errors, right, the site doesn't work very well. This isn't very good. We should actually show the user an error page instead. Fortunately, Visual Studio, it's kind of weird. They've given us an error page. Under shared, we've actually got an error page. So let's open this up and let's modify the code a little bit. So if an error happens, we take the user to an error page if the details is not, either the ID is not found or the ID is null. So there's one issue here. Let's just delete this code from line 9 to 14. We don't need it. Just get rid of it. And a number of you have seen this error page before on Azure when you got errors. This is the page that loaded. And you're probably wondering, well, where the heck did that page come from? It's actually in your project all along. It's the error view under shared. So just delete that section of code, that server-side block that was on 9 to 14. So basically, we just have static HTML on the page. Let's go back to the products controller. So I'm going to comment out line 40. And instead, we want to return the view called error. We don't have to specify the path. If there's not a file called error under products, the server will automatically check for a view called error under shared. So instead of returning not found, we want to return the error view. So now if I try to refresh my product details page without any ID parameter, instead of getting a blank screen, the error page should load instead. And you can customize this error page. We could make our own custom 404 page if we wanted to. For now, I'll just leave it as the error view. Let's do the same thing on line 49. Instead of just returning a 404 response, again, let's return the error view here as well. If you wanted to, yes, you could. You could put something in the view bag. Yep, sure, that would be fine. Probably in a production environment, rather than using this page, I guess I can do it quickly. We could create a 404 page that's specific. So I could add an empty view here. I'll just do this if you want. I'll create a view called shared 404. And we'll just put on so if we want, we could load the 404 page instead, I guess. So maybe instead of loading the error view, I'll load the 404 view. For these specific errors, because they are 404 not resource not found errors. So instead of loading the general error page, I'm going to load a specific 404 page. You can do either one. I think that may just be a warning, Kevin. I don't think I was able to add it. It's fine. You can just use the general error view. Right? So I get this response. It's fine. Don't worry about it. If you load the error view instead, that's fine. Interesting. We also should modify the return statement here on line 53. What do we need to do with the return view statement on line 53 when we do have a valid product? We did it in our index method. So what should we change on 53? If we get a product ID, nope, it's not product. What's the name of the view we are returning in this case? The product is the data model, right? So we want to return the view called details and pass in the product object that matches the ID. So the unit testing is helping us clean up the code here. We're giving the user a better experience in the browser rather than just showing them a blank screen. If the ID is null or not found, we're giving them a not found page. And then we're being very explicit and intentional about the name of the view we're going to return. So now we want to write our 4 unit tests. We want to call the details method with no ID. and make sure we get the 404 page or the error page, whichever one you're using. We then want to call it with an ID that doesn't exist in our mock database. And again, we want to make sure we get the 404 back. In our last two tests, we're going to pass in a valid ID. We want to check that we get the view called details. And in our final test, we want to make sure that we get the proper matching product. So if we pass in an ID, we should get back the product that matches that ID. So as Lindsay said, we need 4 tests, but they're all pretty similar, so this shouldn't take us too long to do. Okay, so there's our completed method. I'll put it up on Pastebin. Again. And now we can write the 4 unit tests we need. So in your assignment, I'm not asking you to unit test the index and details methods, because we're doing those. I'm asking you to unit test one of the other methods in one of your controllers. So it's not actually that much work. Most of the work is just setting up the in-memory database and your mock data. So I'm going to go back to my unit testing class. Now I've got 2 tests in here so far. If we were going to unit test the whole controller, this is going to get really long. So one of the nice things Visual Studio has is it gives us the ability to create code sections where we can group sections of code together called regions. So what I'm going to do is take this code for our index tests, just going to indent it, and I'm going to use the hashtag region. And then I'll put in an end region index. So this means all of the unit tests for the index method are in here. This is totally optional. You don't need this, but that also lets me contract that entire section rather than just one method at a time. So I'm going to create a new region called details and end region details. So then we can write the 4 unit tests for details in here. So this is just a way of organizing our code a little bit. So I'll create our first test method. So details, we'll say no ID returns 404. So we want to test the details method without passing an ID, and we may want to make sure that we get redirected to our 404 page. So we can act and assert. So the first 3 tests are all going to be almost identical. We'll create a result, which is equal to our view result, controller.details. I'm not going to pass in any ID. So if we call details without any ID, we're going to assert.r equal 404 and the name, view name of our result. So with no ID, I should get the 404 page. If, like Kevin, you couldn't create the 404 page, then you'd be checking that the name of the view is error instead. I'll just run that test. Pretty simple test. Okay. So there's our first test. It passes. If we don't pass in an ID, this if statement runs and we get redirected to the 404 page. Our next test is going to be almost the same. I'll actually copy it and paste it. So we should make two changes here. What two things do we change in this test? Yeah, so let's provide an ID. And we should also rename the method name, right? We can't have two methods with the same name. So what should we? It's not no ID. Yeah, non-existing or invalid ID returns 404. You can call it whatever you like, but something that describes the ID. Now, in this case, I can use any product IDs except which ones? What values should I not use for the product ID? We're testing the scenario where the product does not exist. Right. So any ID number except 37, 64, or 56. Any ID but 37, 56, as these are all valid IDs in the in-memory DB. So anything else? If I pass in ID 6 and run my test, it should pass. It does. If I put in 56 and run it again, my test should fail now. If this ID exists, my test is expecting the 404 page, but in this case, the details view is going to load if my ID is valid. So I want some kind of invalid ID here. Copy my test again. I'm going to rename this one to valid ID loads details view. And again, I can use, in this case, I want to use one of my valid IDs. So I'll use maybe 64. And in this case, rather than loading the 404 page, this will load the details page. So I just renamed the method to describe the result we're expecting. I put in a valid ID this time. So we've tried 3 scenarios. No ID, an ID that doesn't exist in our database, and then lastly, an ID that does exist. So the first 2 should give us a 404, our 404 page. A valid ID should give us the details view. Run the test. And then we just have one more test to run. Now this is interesting. Why? Let's see what's going on. Why are my tests failing? Let me run this. This should pass. Sometimes the test checking gets a bit stuck. Okay, so my test passes. It's not telling me the result of my test. I'll try and run it through my test explorer. Test, run all. Okay, so in Test Explorer, it's showing me, I'm not sure why it's not updating in the controller. So all my tests are passing. So we've done 3 details tests. No ID, invalid ID, valid ID. The last test we need, I'll just copy and paste it, is the details valid ID returns matching product. So I can keep using a valid ID. Try running it through the Test Explorer. Do test and run all tests. Yeah, sometimes the Test Explorer doesn't update. I'll look at that in just a minute. So in this case, we want to check our model. So we want to make sure, so our var model equals, we're going to cast it as a product, our result.model. So we're getting a single product back. And in this case, if I pass in 64, that's product 1 in my array. Yeah, make sure you've got the test method above it if they're not running. Okay. So we're going to assert our equal product 1 and our model. So the data that comes back is equal to the second product here, ID 64. If I passed in 56, obviously I'd be checking. Yeah, make sure you've got the public scope in your class as well. So now I'll, again, run all my tests. And these should be the only valid IDs. So now in Test Explorer, I don't know why it's not updating here. Oh, now it finally updated. So all my tests are passing. And if I run, clearly, Dan, if I run, I'll help debug if anybody needs in a minute. Okay. So now it's easy. I've got these regions so I can expand or contract them, right? So if I want to hide all the details tests, I can just close that up. So 4 details tests. If I analyze my code coverage again, details should turn blue and should show as 100% covered. So in the products controller, details is now also 100% covered. And if I turn on the color coding, everything in details as well, index in details, it's now blue. We've tested all the scenarios. Obviously, we're not going to unit test the whole thing. And in your assignment, I'm not asking you to unit test the whole thing. The scope is small. Pick one controller in your assignment and pick one of the methods. One other note here, if you choose create post or edit post in the assignment, So here's one of the create posts. There is a check for if model state is valid. So you would need to simulate the model state being invalid in order to check that condition. So to do that, you can manually create a model error with this code. So in your unit test, if you're testing a post method and you want to simulate that scenario, you can use this code and it will generate a model error for you. So you can check what happens when there is a model error in a post. If you're doing one of the get methods, you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so you have until Tuesday to do it. You do have a quiz as well based on today's unit testing. Yeah, the test method, Dan, has to be above every single test or the Test Explorer will not run it. Okay, I'm going to push everything up to GitHub. That is it for today. So we've got your assignment 2 and your quiz are due next week. Next week, we'll have our last lesson. Will be brief. We should be done by about 12:30, where we're going to build a very simple API using some scaffolding tools in Visual Studio. You're not going to have to write any code. And then your assignment 2, part 3, easy 5%. You're just scaffolding a similar API controller in your assignment. Okay, I'm going to push everything up to GitHub. I do have some office hours time tomorrow of slots available if anybody needs. And I will upload the videos to YouTube as soon as WebEx is finished converting them to MP4s.